But perhaps if we can just spend a few moments with each of the speakers here, talking about, just briefly introducing yourselves. Let's start off with Shashikant, please.
Yeah, so my name is Shashikant. I guess that's what Stephen, you meant.
I was trying.
Right. All right. So, hi everyone. I think you want us to introduce the affiliation, the role, and the brief description of what it means. So, I'm director of offshore engineering at WSP, and I'll talk about WSP very briefly in a bit. In this role, I'm responsible to lead, mentor, develop a multidiscipline team who's going to be then responsible to deliver a value-added consulting and professional engineering services, specifically in the area of offshore wind. About WSP, WSP is among the top 10 engineering consulting organizations in the US with over 50,000 employees worldwide and over 10,000 employees here in the US. I have about 20 years of experience starting from research, detailed engineering, fabrication, to all the way offshore installation and commissioning. I have worked at the fab yards in South Korea for a couple of years. I have also worked with the yards along here in the Gulf Coast. And for last 10 years, I would say I have been fortunate to have opportunity to work both in offshore oil and gas and offshore wind. And I'm truly glad to be here to participate in this panel discussion.
Lovely, thank you. Danielle?
Morning, afternoon, we're somewhere in between. Thanks to you, Steve and Luz, for having me. My name's Danielle. I graduated with a degree in chemical engineering and started working for Shell after college. That was in New Orleans supporting oil and gas, including working offshore rotations for a couple of years. After that, I went back into the office and supported different offshore assets, mostly in operations, doing also some small projects. And then about a year and a half ago, I moved to Boston with my family, and now we support offshore wind. So I support the Mayflower project. It's half Shell, half Ocean Winds, which is also a partnership inside of itself. We own a lease, or we lease an area offshore of Massachusetts. So we're developing an offshore wind project in that area. I'm on the technical team. My role is integration manager, which is a little bit made up, but I work across the technical team, package leads to make sure we're making long-term value decisions, and then also work between the technical team, commercial, and permitting to make sure we have the right size envelope and we're communicating with each other and stakeholders to make sure the project can develop. So happy to talk about my experience and hear questions that you guys have.
Thank you so much. Amanda?
Yeah, thanks, Steve. And thanks, SUT, for inviting me. I'm kind of at a different speed from everybody else here who's kind of in the industry. Some of you who are joining may know me from LinkedIn, but I am Amanda Rico, and I own my own business, Rico Editorial Services, specialize in oil, gas, and energy career materials, resumes, cover letters, LinkedIn, that kind of stuff. I have my BA and MA from the University of Oklahoma in English and a PhD in English from Texas A&M. Heard somebody talking about A&M earlier, so gig 'em. And Boomer Sooner, you know, both equally. But yeah, I'm kind of in a unique space here, getting to chat with some, really awesome people in the industry. I'm, a clean energy mentor with Suncast, and I've worked with a lot of people who've transitioned to clean energy from oil and gas. That's really kind of my niche. So happy to be here, and yeah, thanks.
Wonderful. And Cristina?
Hi, so my name is Christina Zwissler. I am on the Shell Offshore Wind Development Team. We are a global team. My current role is the team lead of wind resource and optimization. So what that means is my team actually designs the wind farms based off of the wind climate that we see at the wind farms. And so we pick the turbine, and we pick the places that we put the wind farms and the turbines. And so we then tell the team how much energy we can produce from those turbines based off of that layout. And so I've been doing this for 8 years now, 5 years now. But I joined Shell in 2013, and our team is pretty global. We work in Asia, Europe, and the US, and all over the place. And so I'm excited to share with you guys some tips on, how we got to here where we are, and what you could do if you'd like to do the same.
Lovely. That's great. Thank you very much. Thanks very much, everyone. Okay, so let's start with our panel discussion now. Let's focus on some of your roles, how they've changed from when you were in traditional oil and gas to moving into renewable energy. Daniela, you started your engineering career at Shell, supporting the Shell Mars and the Ursula platforms. You're now working on the joint ventures you mentioned earlier between Shell and Ocean Winds. How did these companies start working together? I wonder if you could describe that, and how did this partnership come into existence?
Yeah, sure. And it came into existence before me, so I can share my experience joining it after also, and maybe a bit of the differences. So in the Gulf of Mexico, Shell's operating style is usually kind of hands-on. So we have a lot of assets that are Shell operated ventures, SOVs that we call them. In the offshore wind space, we have a lot of non-operated or joint ventures where we're equal partners with other companies, in this case, Ocean Winds, which is also a partnership. So I think they often start because both companies have different experience that they are lacking and see in each other. So the Shell side, obviously, we have a big footprint in the US offshore, and that's sort of why I got here. So experience with the Coast Guard, search and rescue, incident command, experience with BOEM, the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, and BSEE, which is maybe lesser of an extent at this point in the wind market, but the regulators we have experience with siting and working offshore in high risk environments. We don't have experience with offshore wind as much. We're getting there in the North Sea, but we haven't built a lot of wind farms and we don't operate many. And that's where we leaned on EDPR. So it was EDPR and ENGIE that made the joint venture that's Ocean Winds. They have quite a bit of transmission experience. They're onshore in the US with wind farms, and they have Moray East and Moray West in the UK. So they have kind of complementary skill sets to what Shell has. And I think getting a partnership, obviously, you can share the experience you have, but you can also share the risk and share the capital investment. So I think those were the pros that the companies kind of saw in each other to make the partnership. And then I think what Shell says that we bring to the table is this offshore experience. So that helped me get my foot in the door here. Some of the project management experience, I think Shell is good at managing risks and opportunities and trying to identify stakeholders and kind of map out those control points and decisions that you have to take throughout the process. So that was also some experience that I was able to bring to Mayflower. And I think so far so good. I think we're still leaning on each other quite a bit. And I think whenever we resource a new position, we talk about if someone in the company might have the right expertise, that we should get it from one of the sponsor companies or externally for filling different positions.
You mentioned your experience before with offshore safety and BOE and others. So how did you come to make the move from offshore oil and gas to offshore wind? How was that done? Presumably an internal process or
yeah,
something?
internal postings. Yeah, so honestly, some word of mouth. I was open for new roles. We in Shell, you have kind of a window where you agree to be in a role. So my window was up and I was ready for what's next. And I was communicating to people that I knew in my network, but I didn't know a lot of people in offshore wind because it is almost a separate like franchise of Shell. So I reached out to people I knew and said, I'm looking for new experiences. I think renewables would be excellent, but I don't know what opportunities exist. And then I just applied to a lot of the jobs in internal postings, jobs that I didn't always think I was fully qualified for. And maybe Amanda can speak to that too. I think women don't often put their foot forward unless they have 10 out of 10 of the requirements. But actually had someone say, I think you would be good for this, you should apply. And that helped kind of push me into the application. Then had interviews with the people hiring in Shell, and then also the joint venture partners had a kind of a quick interview with me based on my experience.
Okay, that's lovely. Thank you so much. Now, Cristina, you joined this Shell about the same time as Danielle. Your background is with the Met-Ocean. So while you're working for the same company, you're both with you're both with the wind work. So how do you see your expertise is different? So how did you transition in from oil and gas into renewables?
Yeah, so I actually originally joined Shell to do wind energy assessment. And then we decided we weren't going to do that. And so I then joined the Met-Ocean team because they were like, oh, well, where do we put her? This is kind of the only place that she makes sense to go. And I had experience in forecasting. So I was doing like hurricane forecasting and climate design for oil and gas platforms. And then about a year and a half into that, we decided, oh, well, let's try this offshore wind thing again. And so I happened to be the only person in Shell at the time that had a little bit of a related experience. And so they asked me to join in on the team. And so ever since 2015, I've been contributing to the offshore wind team. And it's been quite a ride. And, it's just kind of goes to show you, because I was going to actually leave because I was interested in being in renewables. And I was this close until I got this position within offshore wind and this opportunity. So just kind of goes to show you, stick in there, hang in there, and the opportunity can present itself when you least expect it.
Now you've got, there would have been offshore wind measurements for Mayflower. How would that vary compared to what's normally done for oil and gas?
Sure, there's a couple differences. So first of all, when you permit for oil and gas, you kind of just throw the measurement campaign in the water wherever you want to in the lease, and you don't really have to permit it. You can just take measurements wherever you want to. But for offshore wind, we have to secure a lease, and then for that lease, you have to actually apply for that permit so that you can measure your wind speeds that you need to measure for a year, and your currents and your waves and everything that you need. We're essentially measuring the same things, just for different criteria, different design criteria. And so, there's similarities in the actual things that we're measuring. And the difference, though, is that the wind speeds are extremely important in this case, because this is like the equivalent of your geology in oil and gas and trying to determine your reserves and how much production you'll have from an oil and gas field. But in this case, we need to know how much wind is out there so that we can know how much energy we can produce and where to put the turbines and whatnot. So we have different instrumentation than we did, but it's pretty transferable. I mean, with a background in meteorology, with a background in ocean observation, it's pretty easy to transition into what we're doing and what we've done for Mayflower. And so we deployed that, and we've been measuring for a couple years. And with our experience in operations, that was really helpful because working offshore is a very critical operation. If you have to make sure that you're doing it correctly, and you have to make sure that you're using the vessels that are appropriate for those operations. And so that was another transferable skill that we had within Shell, is we had the right expertise to know which vessels were applicable to deploy these giant buoy systems that are basically a small vessel in themselves.
You mentioned the importance of understanding the wind, because that's your resource base. How are these? You're now talking large buoys. So how are these comparing to what was used in oil and gas?
Sure. In the size, they're slightly bigger because you have to put these instruments that are called LiDAR systems that can measure the wind speeds at different levels in the atmosphere. So every 10 meters up to maybe 250 meters, you're measuring a wind speed with a laser. So that's pretty cool. And it's a huge difference. And we don't deploy those for oil and gas. We don't need them. And so you have to have a bigger buoy to be able, and more power to be able to power the bigger systems that you're now putting onto those buoys. And so, those are the biggest difference. That's the biggest difference, is that you need those instrumentation for offshore wind.
Thank you.
We don't usually. Mm-hmm.
Now, Amanda, as an expert on helping senior executive level professionals to optimize their resumes, have you seen the market change over the last year?
Oh yeah, hugely. Kind of post 2020 has been a whirlwind. I think that what's unique about the shifts, though, is that people are figuring out that they have transferable skills they didn't realize they had before. They've kind of been doing their thing in oil and gas for so long that they didn't think of the fact that they do project managing, that they do operations management, that they do permitting and regulatory work and all this different stuff, and how transferable that can be to new sectors. Especially thinking through clean energy. I talked to so many people who are like, well, I want a job and I think going into clean energy would be cool. And I'm like, oh yeah, that's great. What do you know about clean energy? And I think that the distinction in thinking through, exactly how to make the move, no matter who you are, no matter if you're entry level or, you've been doing what you've been doing for 30 plus years, is thinking through that target, kind of what are they going to want to see? What skill sets are they going to need? And then thinking through what you have, right? Kind of cross-referencing and figuring out a synthesis between those two, and then picking up on what you need to have in order to meet those minimum qualifications, right? So I think so far, Danielle and Cristina have been picking up on, some of the most important aspects of, your job search in terms of maneuvering your way, right? Kind of thinking through, okay, if this is my target, this is my goal, what are the steps I need to do, right? It's not just about kind of reaching out willy-nilly. I mean, it's about having a strategic goal and saying, okay, this is my next step. This is where I want to be, and this is where I am now. Okay, so how do I get there? And then kind of strategizing, maneuvering, your way. I think, the networking aspect is huge. Also having your materials lined up to figure out, okay, so I know that they're going to need this skill set. So how do I get that, or how can I prove that I can do it, right? Kind of thinking of those details, accomplishments, having people go to bat for you is a big one, because the transition from oil and gas to clean energy isn't always as clean as a lot of people think it's going to be. They're like, oh, it's both energy. It's like, yeah, but really not. And I think that's that's kind of what you've been picking up on too, Cristina, is that there are similarities, but you also need some very specific technical skills for some of this stuff. And there are things that people may not think about in terms of, having a background in meteorology or, oceanography or things like that, that you can bring to the table that may not have made sense in oil and gas, but now in this new space, they make a lot more sense. So yeah, I mean, I know that we had, kind of thought about what type of roles would be best, but I think that this is even showing that it takes all different types of roles to figure out, and it just has to do with more of your strategy and how you get there.
Yes, understanding what your experience has been in the past, and then being able to redirect it to what the renewables are looking for.
Yeah, being pretty laser focused, right? Not just saying, well, I don't know what I want to do. I know that I've done operations, but I just want to shoot for clean energy, whatever that is. Avoid doing that at all costs. Figure out where you're the best fit, and then figure out if that's even something you'd want to do, right? And a lot of that comes down to doing informational interviews too, right? Talking to people who already do that job. You're not reaching out saying, do you have a job available? But reaching out and saying, hey, what do you do in a day? I just kind of want to learn about what it is you do. And that's how you start building those relationships and figure out the fit, so that you can go forward with a really solid strategy and market yourself the right way.
Okay. So moving on, thank you so much. Let's focus now on the difference and some of the differences and similarities between oil and gas and the offshore renewable energy market. Shashikant, you recently appointed the Offshore Engineering Director at WSP, and your background covers facilities engineering worldwide. through from fabrication, commissioning, through to integration work. So what skills have you been able to translate from one application to the other, please?
So I would like to start by attesting some of the things that the previous panelists have said, especially Amanda, you mentioned that having a strategic plan. So I kind of very much relate to that. It's like having your own strategy. We all work for large organizations and they have a business strategy, right? So I look at it having your own personal strategy, which kind of complements business strategy and also your career goals. So that's kind of the, in a way, the roadmap I had set for. So I had my first experience with the offshore wind was with the Cape Wind project. That is the first proposed offshore wind project here in the US, which is about 11 years ago. And when I look at it in a hindsight now, I kind of look at it as like a broadly speaking, our skill sets in 3 domains. So if you visualize a kind of a Venn diagram with the 3 circles, in the first circle, you have the more like a domain knowledge, knowledge that we gain out of a university. It can be anywhere from an associate degree to a PhD degree. Think about the second circle, more like an industry specific knowledge. And of course, there is quite a bit similarity, at the same time differences between offshore oil and gas and offshore wind. And then the third part, which I guess it was also mentioned, is more on your softer skills, like your project management, business development, communications, and people management, and so on. And I think this is not necessarily exclusive to an engineer, but it can be to any professional. And many times we have the skill sets in one of the 2 of the 3 domains, and it's more about how we can present ourselves, make it marketable, position strategically for that third circle, so that for going into, in a way, transforming from being an oil and gas professional to an more like a renewable energy professional. And I would say, going back to your question, Steve, when you look at it and do it in a more like in a strategic, structured way, you will see that there are almost all your skills are transferable, if that makes sense.
Yes, I can understand that very much. Now, how do you see the similarities between these offshore projects, both for oil and gas and for wind energy? How do you see them the same, and how do you see them were not quite the same?
So there are a few, I think, within offshore wind development, and specifically what's happening here in the US, which is the Northeast region, which is, I would say, a lot more active, a lot more progressed compared to, let's say, if you take a West Coast. In the East Coast, what we're going to have is primarily wind turbine foundations, which are going to be fixed platforms, right? It could be either monopiles or a tripod type of structures. They're going to be, these are going to be power producing platforms, and then all this power is going to come to a kind of call it as a central location, which is going to be the OSS, what we call the offshore substation platform. So if we now think about it, the turbine foundation structure is going to be very similar to what we are used to seeing in offshore oil and gas. The major difference here is, of course, taking into account the aerodynamic loads from the turbines. On the other hand, if you look at the OSS platform, an offshore substation platform, to me, that's a very similar to an unmanned wellhead platform. Pretty much similar in size, similar in the way the general layout will be. So there is actually quite similarity in that respect. On the other hand, now if we go to a deeper waters, where we now going to go more into the floating wind turbine structures, the things will look dramatically different. So yes, there are similarities, but as the industry progresses, the new technology develop, I think we're going to start to also see a lot of, I would say, peculiarities of offshore wind.
Lovely, thank you so much. Danielle, how do you see the difference with the way projects evolve the similarities and difference as you move forward with these projects, please?
Yeah, I think we can start from where the others left off, but obviously oil and gas, you're making one large platform, and offshore wind, we're probably going to have 80 to 150 foundations separately. I came from deep water, so the platforms used to be floating where I lived, and now we're unmanned jackets or monopiles, which are fixed to the seafloor. So there's obviously some inherent differences in how we'll structure logistics and installation and construction. But maybe to take a step back, how we manage developing a project and the risk is different. That really changes what we do and how we take decisions early on. So in oil and gas, you have very high risk, but huge upside, right? You could have no well, you could spend $100 million drilling something and come up empty. But you could also have, 20%, 30% returns on an investment because you had actually a large range of uncertainty, but you hit the upside of that subsurface. In wind, we won't have high upside, but we also should have minimized our risk at the time that we get to investment. So we, like Christina said, we'll put a buoy, we'll measure the wind resource, we'll know how much wind we expect in our area. Hopefully we'll get a power purchase agreement, which is where a state will pay us a fixed purchase price, so we don't have a fluctuating oil price. Over time, we'll de-risk all of our contracts by planning and having preferred suppliers. We'll try to, at each point, take decisions that lowers our risk. So at financial investment decision, we're low upside, but low margins, still making money, but lower percentage returns, but very stable returns because we have all of these things kind of in hand. And that means we need third-party insurance, but we have the ability to get debt financing instead of just using our own cash flow from Shell or your sponsor company. That means we effectively get a better return because we got to use kind of a low interest loan from these folks. But we have to do more due diligence because these investors have to make sure that it's really, really low risk for them. So that means we don't spend money pre-financial investment decision. If we don't have to, we try to make sure the interfaces are really clear between packages, because if you have a gap, then that's a risk that insurance might not cover you for. So we're doing all the project planning in kind of a stricter way. It's like a little bit harder because we have to really stand up to this like third party outlook at us. Not that oil and gas projects are easy either, because you can come up at zero, like the oil could just not be there, but we fundamentally have a little bit more rigor and interface management and integration discussion here. And then obviously, like Shashikant said, permitting, we're very frontier on the East Coast, so there's still some risks in supply chain and still kind of getting our feet under us because offshore wind in the US is new. So those hurdles hopefully start to go away after the first few projects get installed. Yeah, so I think it's really fun, but it is some the same, risks and opportunities, stakeholders, permits, but a lot of it is approached a little bit differently.
Okay, wonderful, thank you. Now, Danielle and Shashikant, how do you see the differences between state and federal jurisdiction on these goals? How do these all come together, please? From the operator perspective, the regulatory agencies, and so on.
You want to go first?
Okay, I can go. So I would say at this point, both the state and federal agencies, they're kind of taking okay, I can speak from the project development point of view. And I think, Danielle, you can speak more from the operator. And on a project development point of view, both the state and federal agencies, they take a design basis approach. So being one of the good, exciting part of this new industry is that you're kind of going from not necessarily back to the whiteboard, but you have a lot of maneuvering capability. things. If you go to offshore oil and gas, there are a lot of things, they are written black and white. Many of those are in the CFRs. Just as an example, in a 30 CFR 250, you have hundreds of standards listed as reference standards. And once they are listed in the CFR, they are incorporated by reference. So that means those standards by extension become a requirement. On the other hand, if you look at an offshore wind development, now back to federal versus state, in the CFRs, we have only 2 standards referenced. So that tells us either 2 things, either only 2 standards are required, or the regulatory is giving us a lot of maneuvering capability. Now, if you move into the state waters, which is typically either 3 nautical miles or 12 nautical miles, depending upon the state to state, there are no CFRs. So in a way, it's left to the owner or developer of the facility to propose a consistent, coherent set of standards. And in a way, if you're in federal waters, you have to still look out for those CFRs. And there are multiple agencies which will have jurisdiction. We talk about BOEM in many times, but there are other federal agencies, for example, Coast Guard. They will have a say. They may not have a say directly, but they will have it behind from BOEM point of view, from BOEM side of it. On the state waters, we will be then interfacing with the state agencies, and so that's kind of the difference. And just to put a context here, a lot of the news or the market movements that you see right now, majority of that movement is actually in federal waters, not so much in the state waters.
Danielle, how are you seeing these as well, please? From the operator side.
I think regulatory, I think that covers most of it. I think especially in geophysical and geotechnical survey scope, we send these boats out and the requirements are different in federal waters and state waters. So we have to modify if we're getting into Massachusetts waters or Rhode Island. It's different for the line spacing, different for how often you would take samples. So just tracking both of those and making sure we're communicating to all the different regulatory bodies it's been a challenge. It's different than oil and gas. We were mostly just federal, so there wasn't the same interface. But we're also developing a lot of new projects here where the cables would obviously need to make landfall. I think in just all of the interactions between states and federal, I've learned a lot in the last year and a half, just how many different groups there are. So you say regulatory, and that means BOEM, who does the leasing and is the main agency for our federal permit, the construction operations plan. But then they have so many agencies that support them and consult. So NIMS, the National Marine Fisheries Service, Coast Guard, the FAA. There's quite a few federal agencies that care how we are impacting the environment and mitigating those impacts. And then states likewise, but then there's also quasi-regulatory groups. So how we get a power purchase agreement comes from the Massachusetts legislature, but that's a different group of people than the siting board who would grant us access to make landfall. And that's a different group of people than the offshore group that looks after the coastal zone management. And that's a different group than who manages the grid, which is a regional group, the ISO New England, the independent system operator. So in some states it's the same. So New York is a state and an ISO, and they are close with their DPU who issues their power purchase agreements, which are ORECs, similar power purchase agreements. But for us, it's quite complex sometimes, and everyone cares, and we want to do a project where we include everyone and we get the right inputs. But it's just a lot of people, and they don't have, the same opinion about what's best often, so I'm not on our permitting team, and I don't pretend to be an expert in that area, but it's a huge challenge to coordinate with the right people. And we have, I think, the right intentions, but you still have so much to manage to try to reduce your impacts and make a safe project.
Lovely.
If I may add, Stephen here, what Danielle is saying is that the good thing is there is still need for human engineers. It cannot be done by AI as of now.
Job
Thank you.
security, is that what
No,
they're
job
doing for me?
security for all of us.
Yeah.
Now, let's moving on now. People in our audience may be in the process of looking to make this transition, just as you have here. But let's talk to Amanda. How can we better communicate our skills here, please?
Oh yeah, well, it's important that those skills are visible, right? So, people only know what you tell them. So, I always talk to people about, okay, so you're on the job hunt or you're thinking about being on the job hunt. Have you reached out to anyone? Have you told anyone? Have you, thought about how you're going to build your LinkedIn or things like that? And many times people are like, no, not really, just kind of going to start hammering out applications. And putting out applications is only one way, to really start getting traction. And honestly, it's typically not the only way that's going to work. So, whenever I think through working with people and figuring out how to get them some traction, I'll always ask them to, kind of figure out what their target's going to be, and then make sure that whatever that target is reflected on their LinkedIn profile. That's a really, really big one. So what I've seen a lot of people do is just put, say that they've been released from a position and they've ended their work history there, and then they just have seeking new opportunities in their headline. I go, no, don't do that. Okay, so the most important thing is that people can immediately pick up on what you excel at, right? So right on your LinkedIn profile and your headline, it's going to be super important to list out the skill sets that you have and kind of what you're shooting for. So if you're shooting for an operations management position in clean energy, make that obvious, all right? Make it very clear in your about and summary section, in your headline, that these are the skill sets that you have. Because it's not just about visibility with people seeing it, let's say colleagues, or former colleagues seeing it. It's also about how the LinkedIn algorithm works, right? So the LinkedIn algorithm is going to pick up certain content that you have on your profile, and that's how you're going to get found by recruiters and HR pros. So, I mean, because I've seen it from the back end. I've seen how recruiters hunt for people on LinkedIn, and that applicant tracking system through LinkedIn, it is not intuitive, guys. There are a lot of limitations to that. So it's important to have as much content as possible on there, while also making sure that the materials that you have to deliver when somebody does reach out and say, hey, I saw that, I found you on LinkedIn, I'd be really interested in calling you in for X position, that you have materials that are aligned with that focus to give them, right? So that means having a resume that's tailored to that type of focus. So, I'll typically tell people, hey, if you're shooting for operations management and business development, you should most likely have 2 different resumes for those, right? Making sure that you have the content tailored to whatever your target is and have that resume specifically lined up for that. So that, say they reach out and, that day, all you have to do is just take 20 minutes to just tailor that specific resume template to whatever they're looking for. So that's the best strategy, for kind of getting traction and making sure that you're as visible as possible, as quickly as possible, right? Because time is also important, because there are so many candidates out there. You want to make sure you're prepared.
Yes, indeed. So, yeah, thank you for that, Amanda. Now, Shashikant, could you share your experience on how you made the transfer, please? How did you move from oil and gas into wind and renewables, please?
In a short answer is do everything Amanda just said. No, I mean, honestly. So it is, I think it goes back to having that personal strategy. And I'm actually, it seems like it's like a flashback when Amanda was saying all those things. And it's kind of the way it is. So just to give an example, I started writing articles about offshore wind a couple of years ago. And it not necessarily from the point of view of having to make that transition, but I was sincerely curious about offshore wind. And one of the ways to get word out is, of course, do some homework, do some research, and do a short article on LinkedIn two things happen. One, people know that you're interested, you're doing some work in it. Secondly, by getting those comments and feedbacks, you open up an opportunities for having some conversations in that regard. Especially, I think that was, I mean, in a way, COVID was useful because there was no other opportunity to interact, so that I started doing more of that. And I don't want to sound a patriarch here, but it's really, the organizations, they have a certain goals, ambitions, and strategy. We have certain goals, ambition, strategy. And one of the ways, I think, Amanda, you would agree, is that the best time to find a job when you are employed or when you are in a job. And one of the best ways to move that career transition is within your own organization, right? And I think Christina, Daniela, you can see those live examples right here. And that's the same thing I did. Also, at the same time, I recognize that sometimes you're limited as an individual. Not everything can be complemented to your business strategy, but that's where you put in a bit more extra efforts. And I don't want to say it in a bragging way, but it's really, that was my part of strategy of giving, for example, 4 PEs in 5 engineering majors, because you need to do something out of ordinary to stand out. And that's, I would say, part of kind of being able to make that transition.
Okay, that's wonderful. Thank you. Do you have anything more to add, Amanda, before we move on, please?
Oh no, I'm really glad that resonated with you, Shashikant, because that's really, I mean, that's really the only way to get traction, right? I mean, is to have that strategic goal. But yeah, definitely thinking through, I mean, if the organization you're already at has opportunities for that, like Shell with you, Danielle, kind of thinking through what that route would take to get there and who to connect with. But being genuine, right? Being a human with other humans is probably the most important thing, because I see it a lot where, people start to feel the desperation, right? They start to feel really that fear, and that drives them to be less personable, less approachable, and just kind of hammer out, connecting with people rather than making it a meaningful, purposeful type of activity. They see it as, okay, maybe if I just do 100 a day connecting with people, maybe then something will happen for me. And unfortunately, that just doesn't work very well. So yeah, definitely finding a job when you already have a job, that's ideal. But if you can't, then definitely connecting with with former colleagues, or maneuvering your way kind of to figure out where that space would be that you can fit. That's best.
Wonderful. Thank you, Amanda. Now, we've heard about how each of you have moved with the change. Let's think about now in the future. Where are we going with all of this? So, Cristina, this is a growing market. Yet we can still see there's gaps to be filled. So where do you see where the gaps are with renewables, where people with oil and gas experience could fit in?
I mean, in general, in the US, there is a shortage of experienced people within the renewable industry. I'm in charge of recruitment for my team, and so I can't find anyone with the amount of experience that I need for my team that can hit the ground running. So, I mean, this is extremely, if you're interested, I mean, please, take the advice that Amanda, Shashikant, and Danielle are giving you, because, if it's not the perfect fit, but you have some transferable skills, because there is a lack of people that have these skills, it's very, very good that you can show that effort, that you are interested in these positions, you're interested in the renewable industry. And then once you get into the company, like Shashikant said, it's easy to remove within your organization. If you find something else, and I see that within offshore wind especially, it's easy to move across the business and to find other positions that you may be interested in. And so I think it's, that's the biggest thing that we're missing within the renewable, and that's just solar, that's onshore wind, that's offshore wind. There's other innovations like wave energy, tidal, but these are the top 3 that we really need more workforce in.
Okay, can you perhaps elaborate more on some of the skills that you see, please?
Engineering skills, regulatory skills, environmental, HSE, anything essentially. I mean, there's quite a bit of folks that that we could place and have those transferable skills within the industry.
Okay, thank you. Moving on to you, Daniela. What are some of the solutions that you have available that make your job easier because of what you've learned in oil and gas, please?
Oh, interesting question. I wanted to add to Christina's skills. Maybe I'll add one thing to hers, which is
please do.
What she said, and Shashikant before her. I came to offshore wind a year and a half ago, and I remember Christina teaching me what a power curve is for a turbine. And now I'm on a panel talking about wisdom that I have in the industry. So really make a jump, and you will learn on a learning curve. If you have an opportunity, take it, even if it's a lateral or you're not a perfect fit, and prove once you get there that you can do more. I think the experience that I brought, I had this imposter syndrome at the beginning that I don't have enough experience in offshore wind because I didn't have any. But there is quite a bit, like I said, with the regulatory agencies, we're talking about if our platforms would be manned or unmanned, and we're hoping unmanned. For safety and reliability, you don't need to be manned. And then we're talking about if you have a helideck on an offshore substation. We're talking with the Coast Guard about how they do search and rescue in the area. And when I was offshore, I was on the incident command structure, the ICS team, where we had drills and events with gas releases and the Coast Guard coming out to do drills with us. So that experience can inform how we might design platforms to be unmanned. And do you have a diesel fuel station? Do you have a helicopter refueling station? How are you actually going to make those things happen safely? So some of those things that I didn't think about are fundamental to how you might live or not live safely on a platform in offshore wind. And that's maybe oddly specific. Not everyone has offshore oil and gas experience to share, but I think project management skills, working with teams, working with people that are different than you, trying to think broadly about what is the end game. If the end game is value returned for your project, you might have a different answer than if the end game is spend no money this year. So you might spend more in order to buy a bigger turbine because overall it gives you more power. And those types of, step back, long-term decision thinking, those apply to all projects in all industries. I think really, really tactically, working from home is exhausting, and I've had this like gray day where I work all day and all night and somehow also don't work at all. I feel like, I'm always at my computer. This is my bedroom, so I'm here. So I'm trying to tactically have a work day and be more efficient and not do laundry or coffee in between. And that's taking some practice. I think that's probably for everyone in every industry, but trying to set priorities, what I'm going to get done this week, and then say no to things that are requiring me to work outside of work hours, like presentation prep for the next day, or, some of these demands that might come from others on my team or my bosses. So yeah, went from oil and gas, Coast Guard to how am I going to actually functionally get my work done this week, but trying to, dress like I'm going to work, sit down to work, and then step away from work while I'm working from home.
Lovely. Thank you, Daniela. Now, Shashikant, where do you see the future of clean energy? Because yourself being in a consultancy role, your view is probably wider than others.
Yeah, Steve, if I may start by saying that even after oil and gas has been ubiquitous for 70 years, we still have coal as part of our energy mix. And earlier today, I saw one of the presentations. It was by Society of Petroleum Engineers, and they showed that in 1919 or 1920, we had coal as about 18 or 20% of energy mix. And guess what? Even after 100 years, coal is about 18 to 20% of energy mix. So which is unbelievable, right? I mean, So the energy demand has picked up, and majority of that was taken by oil and gas, and rightfully so. So personally, if I can put now back to my personal strategy here. So I have about 25 years of professional life, and in my lifetime, I would say, or professional lifetime, I think it will be both. We will have oil and gas and renewables. Christina mentioned the top three, which is, I fully agree. Especially here in the US regional market, it's going to be offshore wind, onshore wind, and solar. Yes, there are multitude of others approaches came up. Some different parts of the world, they are doing more about it, but I think in the US, I would say that these are three technologies which is going to start replacing whatever the growth that we have in the energy demand. And one thing, if I may say, is that in all of this, there is always a wild card, right? Which is what we call more like a disruptive technology, something which we don't know about. Like people talk about hydrogen, and if something, and UK is doing, I think, big pilot project with respect to being able to use hydrogen. If something that comes up, all our, so to say, metric benchmarking will have to re-establish the baseline. Let's put it that way. But going forward for next 20 years, renewables is definitely in the growth area. Some people may want to say that oil and gas is in declining. I would like to call it more like a steady state.
Yes, I can see that from what I'm seeing as well from here. So thank you. Okay, well that's wonderful. Now let's have some take-home messages with all of this discussion. Amanda, what are some of the pieces of advice you'd like to give to our audience as a takeaway, in particular those that are actively looking for a new job, please?
Sure. Don't try to be too general, right? Think of your transferable skills in the sense that not that you want to go like this, but that you want to start here and then you want to narrow down, right? So think of all the things that you have, kind of brainstorm, take a week to just hammer out all the different things that, you're really good at and that you enjoy, and then narrow those down based off of what a specific target might be. And really figure out that target, kind of what Shashikant was talking about. Get involved in the things that you're interested in. Don't just, think, oh yeah, it'd be cool to get into wind. No, start researching, start engaging with people, publish, get onto industry panels, start to get some visibility, because that's what's really going to get you traction. Is thinking through that strategy of, okay, I don't just want to get a job, I want to be in this new sector, and I want to be seen as someone who's desirable in this new sector, not just someone who's going to be coming in at an entry-level position, right? Because that's also a challenge, is switching sectors, even switching sectors sometimes in oil and gas, going from upstream to downstream or to midstream. Sometimes that can take a demotion too. So much more so if you're shifting to a completely different type of industry. So yeah, think through what you bring to the table, but also be strategic about where you're going to land and if you actually want to land there. So.
Lovely, thank you. Cristina, what advice from your side, because you've been involved in this industry a long time and you say you've been recruiting people, how can you advise those that are looking for jobs in this renewable industry, please?
Ditto to everything Amanda said, but also, and then what I said before about, you may not get the perfect ideal job, but if you can get your foot in the door, then there's your opportunities to find that ideal job and that perfect job. Also, think creatively. That job may not exist, and you could help, invent that job later on. Danielle said that her job sounds made up, or it did exist before Danielle. So, I mean, these things come up frequently because offshore wind is a new industry. So things are going to come up that you don't know about. And so make sure that you're keeping your options open, being open-minded, and then, how do you transfer those skills to those jobs that are available right now?
That's wonderful. Now, how can people learn more about renewables and then transition if they're interested? How would you see that from your perspective, Christina?
Yeah, so I think that networking is a huge thing. You know, if you can reach out to people that can help you learn, and I don't know all the courses. I know that you can. DNVGL has free courses that you can learn online, and I think the Technical University of Delft has some online courses as well. They have a specific one for offshore wind and how things, you know, how you develop a project in offshore wind. And again, I don't know everything, but if you network, you can find other folks that may have some really good suggestions. I am basically self-taught. I didn't know anything. I didn't even know what a power curve was, 20 years ago. But I taught myself all this information because there's not a program in the US that's available for graduate students that will teach you how to do offshore wind. Well, there weren't back then, but now there are. And so, continuing learning from different universities can also be an option if you really want to go down that road. But yeah, just keep with it and show your interest. If you're interested in something, then make it a priority. Don't be stuck in something that you don't enjoy, because life is short, and do something you enjoy.
Can I add a couple too? I think Coursera has a free offshore wind course that's decent. And then the BOEM has published in the Federal Register all of the construction operation plans that they have started reviewing. So I think Vineyards is there, South Fork, and I think they just issued the notice of intent for Revolution Wind. So different companies proposing different projects with different project sizes, and a bit of it's redacted, but there's a lot of interesting information about how they're planning to set up and operate their wind farms. So offshore wind specific, but just Google BOEM and a COP, Vineyard, South Fork, or Revolution. And those are PDFs on the internet.
You mentioned Coursera, say?
Coursera, yeah, Coursera. They have all kinds of things. They have machine learning and artificial intelligence classes, but they have one on offshore wind. That's offshore wind power generation, transmission, permitting. It's pretty good.
That's lovely. That's wonderful. Thank you all, folks. Now, before we pass it on to our questions and answer session, does anybody have a final remark? Because we've got a minute or two left before we move into questions and answers.
I just really love whenever Danielle mentioned that this is like a made-up role. I don't know, it was an integration manager too. This happens a lot. I mean, this happens so much. I mean, it's a compliment because they basically made up the role for you. But be mindful, I think, also for people who have this happen to them, especially at big level companies like Halliburton or Schlumberger or Shell or whatever. Sometimes these big companies do that. If you decide to go on the market again, make sure you explain what that means. Right? Like use the key terms to, like, in parentheses, 80% project management or something like that. That kind of gives them a sense of what you're shooting for and what you did. Because sometimes that can trip you up a little when you go back on the market. But I thought that was weird.
Great. Thank you very much. Right. We finished our formal discussion here. Lutz, how are you fixed for any questions and answers, please?
Thank you so much for such a wonderful panel. I really, really enjoyed it. We have already some questions on the chat, so if you don't mind, I'm going to start with them. The first one, Amanda, I find it challenging to pin down my transferable skills. Is there a comprehensive list of transferable skills that you can suggest which could act as guide for reflection?
That's a big question, man. Comprehensive list of transferable skills. No, I do not currently have one of those. But what you want to do is make sure that you're not just thinking so broadly that you spin yourself out of, into the stratosphere, right? So you want to start with what you have, right? So take a look at the resume you currently have and think through what the types of keywords, phrases keep popping up and the job descriptions you're looking at are looking for, right? So you start to cross-reference, kind of like what I was saying. You start to cross-reference what you have, or you may look at job descriptions and be like, oh, they keep mentioning project management and they want someone who has a PMP. That's probably something good to pick up on in terms of figuring out what you might want to get. And then that goes to you doing your brainstorming sessions, writing down what your top transferable skills are, right? So you don't necessarily want to think so broadly that you're starting from someone else's list or from a giant list that's only going to make you feel more frustrated and lost. You want to start with the transferable skills that you already have grounded in the experience that you have. So project management, operations management, regulatory due diligence, there's all sorts of different things. Engineering, which could be very broad or very specific, right? So strip the oil and gas jargon and think through what it is you actually do in a day, right? Are you doing cost analysis? Are you doing economic evaluations? Are you doing asset management? All these things end up being transferable skills. So,
right. Thank you. And I also think what you've said, like one solution doesn't fit all, so it cannot be like a single list, right? Like you have to tailor that one. So the next one, Cristina.
I think Shashikant wanted to add something.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, I just want to say from my own personal experience, one of the ways individually you can gather those comprehensive lists is going through the job descriptions. So, and I think Amanda, I can see you nodding, is that it's not going to be a comprehensive list, but it's a list of those key skill sets which are specifically suited for the type of the job that you're looking for.
Right. Yeah, use them like blueprints, because those job descriptions are going to tell you exactly what they're looking for. And the more that you can narrow down exactly to what type of role you'd want to be in what industry, then you're in the home stretch, right? At that point, once you know kind of, okay, I want to be an offshore wind and I want to be a project manager, that's when you know that you can really just bang out your strategy and start networking with purpose and then really maneuver your way into where you want to be.
Thank you both. So now, Cristina, I know you're ready for it. What technical skills on the science side, as opposed to project management, are the most common in your work?
In my work, it's meteorology, it's oceanography, it's computational fluid dynamics, electrical engineering, structural engineering. I mean, there's quite a bit that's applicable within the offshore wind space. So it's not a comprehensive list, but
and the next one is also for you. It says, is your offshore wind team predominantly technical? Can you recommend entry paths that a mid-career geoscience specialist with a recent MBA degree might explore?
So I sit within the technical team specifically, and that just happens to be where we sit. But we've also got a commercial team. We've also got, so they like write up all the contracts and help us procure like the studies, the desktop studies that we want. There's also business opportunity managers, and there's also evaluation leads. So economics, people running economics. So there's other fields within, that have to do with what the topic here is offshore wind, that you can actually, come in at a mid-range and with I think you said MBA?
Yes, MBA.
Yeah, that's for evaluate economics. I mean, those are economists are kind of shorthanded right now. So yeah, looking for roles where you can, actually run the LCOE, the levelized cost of energy for these projects, and having a knowledge and how that works and kind of coming in that space is also super helpful.
Thank you, Cristina. The next one is not addressed to anyone. So it says, I have already transitioned from oil and gas, subsea engineering with an OEM, into renewable, onshore wind, doing WRA and layout optimization for the same OEM. But I would like to utilize my previous skill set to get into offshore wind. Do you have any advice for me? Any recommendations for additional technical knowledge I should try to gain that to make me a good candidate? Maybe Danielle,
yeah.
Cristina?
That is
I did subsea for a minute. So It's a good skill to have.
WRA, wind resource assessment and onshore wind, it's very applicable to offshore wind. There's not a huge difference, but understanding what the differences are between an offshore environment and an onshore environment are pretty important. So taking some of those courses that, describe how you develop an offshore project, and then that can help you formulate the differences between what's going on. LiDAR systems, you need to know how those work back and forth and up and down, and that's a really key part of what's going on within the offshore wind resource assessments.
We have a few folks on our team that came from the subsea group in Shell, and so subsea cables are obviously different than hydrocarbons, but we have quite a bit of overlap with routing, working with our G&G team, geophysical and geotechnical teams that are doing the surveys, and then how we're going to install and protect cables once they're laid, including how you make landfall with potentially horizontal directional drilling, which is similar in subsea versus offshore wind. So if you want to go back to the subsea routes, then cables, cable installation, transmission systems, any jobs that kind of have some of those words might be applicable too.
Thank you both.
I think it's going to be pretty unique for geologists to be hearing that you guys use you guys have G&G specialists, because a lot of geologists, they don't think outside, not necessarily they don't think outside, but it's not well known, right, that there's a space in wind for them. And so they just, are kind of hammering away at the upstream sector. And I think that probably getting the word out there a little bit more, I'll probably be doing this. It's giving me ideas. Get the word out a little bit more about
for
G&G specialists and
for design of cables and installation. When we install turbines, we'll probably use a jackup vessel at some point, and they put their spud cans in the ground. So we need to know quite a bit engineering and also permitting about the soil conditions and what our site looks like.
Awesome.
Nice. For the next question, I think we've covered half of it, but it says, what areas or disciplines transfer easiest with oil and gas skills, and which are hardest skills and disciplines to transfer?
So if I can just chime in with my Venn diagram one more time.
I think we need an image.
So I think fundamentally structural engineers, mechanical engineers, electrical engineers, and again, I don't mean to say that it has to be a bachelor's, master's, or those kind of degrees. Even with an associate degree, you're going to always find, even if you just pick onshore civil engineering, right? I mean, someone who's working with the bridges all the time, they're going to have the same transition to make if you go for the rail lines. They have the same transition to make if you want to work on the dams. You have the transition to make if you want to go with the power plants, right? So there's what's common here is that you have to look at the domain knowledge, industry specific knowledge, and the what you call more on the softer skills. And again, they're not necessarily softer skills doesn't mean that you have to have it, you need to be born with it. They can be developed over a period of time, and there are different ways to do it. But one has to look at all this domain knowledge. It's always transferable from one industry to another. And then of course you have to look at what you have, which kind of role you would like to target, what are those buzzwords, or what are those specific knowledge and competencies, do the mapping, and come up with your own strategic plan.
Thank you.
Because it can be just as challenging to shift, say someone's been doing onshore, drilling and completions for the past, 10 years, and they want to shift to offshore. A lot of people won't take a chance on them, right? I mean, but you know how to drill, right? So, I mean, you have the knowledge, but it's a different environment, and it's about kind of figuring out what that skill set would be, and then how to gain it as much as you possibly can, or learn on the job, or just kind of get your foot in the door for that.
But to reflect that, people can reach out to people like you, Amanda.
Sure.
To tailor resumes.
Can't get you a job, but I can write some stuff for you.
The next one says, given the pandemic and remote working, where is the wind energy and other renewables work hub in the US as compared to Houston, commonly known as the oil and gas hub? Do I need to move there?
Yes,
I
come
think you're on
here.
mute, Danielle. Oh, okay.
Come to Houston.
I live in Houston, and Danielle, you're in Boston. So, I mean,
Yeah.
it's been pretty flexible so far within the industry.
Once again,
I
if
think,
I can chime in, my
yeah, I
job.
think it depends too.
Yeah,
Sorry, go ahead. I'll maybe add after.
Yeah, I was just going to say that the current role that I'm in, that was actually opened for Boston, but through the interview process, I managed to convince my manager that Houston is a better place. So
I'm sorry.
That's part of the
Strategic.
negotiation, right?
Yeah. I think we're a bit more Boston based. So we're a project. We have a lease that's offshore Massachusetts. We have a power purchase agreement with the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. So we have a little bit more where we want to develop and show that we're a presence here. We have an office that's close to where I live now. And as soon as it's safe and folks are vaccinated, we'll be back meeting together and holding port hours because we do have a lot to interface with directly in the state or the Commonwealth. But it depends. We have plenty of people that are still in Houston or support us. Our one of our directors is in the UK now, so we'll see when COVID actually moves on that we can travel safely. I think Boston and New England. I think there's some New York offices for some different developers, depending on where their leases are. So it's not a singular place, but I do think Boston is a pretty big hub for offshore wind now.
Thank you. And the next one says, most renewable job postings require experience in renewables. Any suggestions on how to address that if all my experience is in oil and gas? Amanda, I feel you want to answer.
Yeah.
Go
Right.
for it.
Well, I mean, and it really does. So you've, people who are listening in have heard from people who essentially have kind of, shifted or maneuvered up in their own organizations, right? And correct me if that's wrong, Christina. I can't recall if you moved up in your organization or if you shifted. So it is so much easier to move up in the organization that you're with, because at that point you've already shown what you can do, right? And this is really why I emphasize networking with people who you've worked with who can go to bat for you, basically, is kind of the terminology, because you need people regardless of what role you've been in. Just like my example that I gave earlier, switching from onshore to offshore, you'd need people to go to bat for you for that too, right? You'd need people saying, hey, you know what, yeah, he's only been in Eagle Ford and Permian, but he can do this kind of work, right? I've seen him do it. So it's kind of the same idea, right? It's that laser focused strategy of what things do I need to fill, right? What are the gaps I have? Can I get additional credentials or education? But then remember, the main focus is on getting work experience as much as you possibly can. So take on projects. Ask people if you can do things for free on the side. If you have a colleague that who can, help you out with maybe getting some side projects or some contract work, get that work as much as you can. Just hustle through it. It takes hustle. And it also takes thinking through your strategic decisions in terms of, if an MBA is the route to get to where you want to be, get the MBA. But don't just get it because you have some extra time, and don't just get it because you think that's going to get you somewhere. It's a lot of money, it's a lot of time, and I see everybody getting them right now, and it's kind of killing me as someone who, has their doctorate. It's like, education is not always the answer, right? Having more work experience in the target that you want to be in is the answer. So if that means getting a PMP instead of getting an MBA, do that, because that's going to get you there faster and it's going to be more impactful in the long run. So again, kind of weighing those strategic decisions in terms of where you want to be.
I have one specific probably example. So it's not always our choice working in an organization to be able to move over to not every company is a Shell, Chevron, or a DNV. That's where I come from. So one of the ways you could actually start working, like Amanda saying, is that ask around and being able to kind of volunteer for that work. And the good opportunity is get into the development of standards. So for example, ACPA, the American Clean Power Energy Association, in their every newsletters, they are calling for volunteers, get involved in the standards committee. You build the network, you build the knowledge, you are in the forefront of that development here in the US, right? Another example, and that reminds me of my friend, he was working in oil and gas, but in his backyard, he designed and built the largest solar project, residential solar project in Houston area. So if I have to recommend someone for a solar energy project, he's going to be my first referral. I mean, he is the one who did that hands-on. So there are many avenues like that. So some of the things that when I used to hear a panel like this, it used to feel like, oh, give me the specific. So that's why I wanted to come up with these examples.
Now, you just made a very smooth transition on the importance of networking, and please join the Marine Renewable Energy Committee that Steve is hosting. So I put the link on the chat. So this is a great opportunity to connect with others and increase your network. So with this, we are done with our session. Thank you so much to our wonderful panelists and moderators, Steve. I really, really appreciate having you here, and thank you so much for those who stick till the end. So thank you very much. We appreciate you and hope you can connect with the SUT network.